On March 21, 1918, the German army began a large-scale offensive on the Western Front in a bid to win the war before the Allies became too strong to overcome. It is very tempting to compare the German Spring Offensive of 1918 with the Ardennes Offensive of 1944 because of the similar strategic premise of winning the war against the Allied coalition on the Western Front. There are similarities between the two offensives, but there are also marked differences. I have made a selection and I will start with the differences. First, the strategic situation was different. In the spring of 1918, Germany was in a winning mood. It had held on to the territory captured since 1914, and Russia was knocked out of the war, which meant an end to the two-front war. By the end of 1917, Italy had been badly mauled during the Caporetto offensive, and the French army was still affected by a mutiny and incapable of launching large-scale offensives. The British army also seemed exhausted after the bloodletting at Passchendaele. The Americans had entered the war in favor of the Allies, but the American army had not yet arrived in strength. The German High Command saw, in other words, a window of opportunity to defeat the Allies in the spring of 1918. This situation was in complete contrast with the run-up to the Ardennes offensive. In the summer of 1944, the German army had suffered disastrous defeats on both the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Since the Allied landings in Normandy, it was engaged in a full-blown two-front war it could not hope to sustain. In September 1944, Germany's enemies were literally on its doorstep, and it was a matter of time before they would go on the offensive to invade Germany itself. The German High Command saw an offensive against a weaker enemy on the Western Front as the only option with a reasonable chance to stave off defeat. Second, the state of the German army was different. The 1918 Peace of Brest-Litovsk with Russia meant that Germany could move hundreds of thousands of fresh troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. This meant a big boost of German manpower strength. As a result of this transfer, the amount of German divisions on the Western Front outnumbered the Allied divisions for the first time since 1914. Germany had, in other words, a large strategic reserve of 56 divisions of fully trained and experienced men. It could choose to go on the offensive with a genuine chance of victory. In the autumn of 1944, the German army was reeling from the dreadful losses on the Eastern and Western Front. The loss of hundreds of thousands of trained and experienced men meant that it was compelled to call up new men to fill the ranks. The recruits had little time for training and no combat experience, but were expected to carry the offensive. The German army painstakingly built up a modest reserve, but even its best efforts were not enough to outnumber the Western Allies. The total number of divisions was slightly even, but in this stage of the war the average rifle strength of a German infantry division was 1/3 below that of an Allied division, and a German armored division had at best half the tank strength of an Allied armored division. This meant that the German army had no numerical advantage like in 1918 and had to solely rely on speed and surprise. Another advantage the Allies had was their complete air superiority, and this brings us to the third major difference: the weather conditions. The 1918 offensive was launched on the first day of spring, the 21st of March. The Germans banked on good weather for dry roads to bring up artillery, supplies and follow-up troops. In 1944, on the other hand, the Germans had to hope for bad weather to keep the Allied Air Force grounded, but they suffered from exhaustion due to the harsh winter weather instead. It has also led to greater wear and tear of their vehicles. The Germans were soon coping with supply difficulties due to mud, snowstorms and icy roads. The attack stalled completely as soon as the weather improved and the Allied Air Force came out in force. Army command was another difference between the two offensives. In 1918, the armies involved in the offensive were divided into two army groups led by royal personalities, the Crown Prince of Bavaria and the Crown Prince of Germany. The decision to let a possible victory shine on the two most important royal houses of Germany was undoubtedly politically motivated, but militarily impractical. Of course, there were more armies and divisions involved in this offensive than in the Ardennes offensive, but it is striking that both army groups also comprised armies which were not attacking. In this light, the choice for two attacking army groups made little sense. In the case of the Ardennes offensive, the army group commands were reshuffled before December 1944 to make sure that the attacking armies were under one army group command, which simplifies command and control under one single commander. After these four major differences, one might ask if there are actually any similarities besides the formation's bid to win the war on the Western Front. Actually, there are some interesting similarities, and the first one is actually very striking. In both 1918 and 1944, the Germans aimed at the weakest Allied sector of the Western Front. By the end of 1917, the British Fifth Army had taken over more front of the neighboring French Sixth Army due to political pressure, and as a result it was overstretched. In March 1918, the Fifth Army was attacked by no less than three German armies. The offensive shattered the British lines and a strategic disaster was looming. In December 1944, the American First Army was in a similar position. Its army corps were stretched out along a very long front line, especially 8th Corps, and it was in this sector that the Germans deployed three armies to attack. In both cases, the Germans attacked in a relatively quiet front sector, where the Allied troops were resting and the Allied units were overstretched. This fact accounted much for the initial German success of both offensives. The second similarity was the strategic aim for the transport facilities of the Allies. In 1944, the Germans aimed for the port of Antwerp, which was the largest deep-sea port for the supply of the Allied armies. In 1918, the Germans went for the Channel ports. When the results of the offensive fell short after a few days, the goals were shifted to Amiens and Arras, the most important rail hubs of the Allies in northern France. It has been argued that the Germans in 1918 were primarily interested in rolling up the British armies from south to north. But in order to do that, they had to upset the British transport system in order to compel them to withdraw. In both offensives, the attack was planned to drive a wedge between the Allied armies, and they would have been deprived of a much-needed rail and port facilities. This similarity also feeds in the final point I want to make regarding the similarity of these offensives, namely speed and transport. After the initial surprise, the 1918 offensive was halted short of the aforementioned transport hubs, Arras and Amiens. This was not a coincidence. After the shock of the initial surprise, the British mustered their fleet of trucks and moved troops from other sectors to the threatened front sector to stem the German tide. In 1944, the German offensive was also hindered by the American truck capacity to move whole divisions at short notice. After the initial surprise of the German attack, the Americans had moved their reserve divisions to vital road crossings at Zandvoort and Bastogne. This crippled the offensive to such an extent that the Americans managed to box it in before it reached the River Meuse. Just as the British had transported their reserves by truck in 1918 to stop the German offensive, the Americans outpaced the Germans in 1944 and brought in thousands of troops by truck. In both offensives, the Germans largely depended on infantry formations, because in 1944 even their mobile divisions had only a small section of truly motorized troops due to lack of vehicles and fuel. In my opinion, both offensives ultimately failed because of the transport factor. Although German infantry had broken through the defensive line by a combination of tactical skill and local numerical superiority, it can in the end not outrun a truck or train. In 1918, the technological advancement did not yet allow for a speedy motorized breakout en masse. But in 1944, the Germans simply didn't have the means to do so due to the lack of trucks and fuel. This is my analysis of the differences and similarities between the German Spring Offensive of 1918 and the Ardennes Offensive of 1944. Please let me know in the comment section your opinion